Welcome back to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the political theology of a fossil fuel addicted, racial capitalism. We'll be talking about the book, The States of the Earth, an ecological and racial history of secularization, with the writer who joins me today, Mohamed Amer Meziane. Mohamed, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I just want to start off here because the book focuses on secularization as a distinct process of European political change, particularly from the 1500s to today, in a way that enables, or is indeed one of the vectors through which colonialism really gets started, and the European states start expanding and try and create their own empires, particularly after the fall of, I guess, what one can call Christendom, with the split in Christianity and the decline of the Holy Roman Empire and this grand European religious Christian project. So particularly, I just want to start off by asking about one of the terms you use in the book, which is you say that we exist in a kind of secularocene. Our time is defined by this split between the state and what it then turns to calling religion as an anthropological category. And this is part of the way in which colonial empires allow themselves to expand. Rather, they secularize for colonial reasons. And that in doing so, this allows what you call their imperiality to spread, not in a way that simply is outside or detached from the Christianity of Europe, but instead as a way of trying to realize that in a way beyond the confines of Christianity itself. And this builds into this whole imperial project. Could you give us a sense of what the general argument is of the book?
Yeah, well, you said many things already, but I suppose I could unpack some concepts. And as you mentioned it, the subtitle of the book is An Ecological and Racial History of Secularization, but it could also be an ecological and racial history of Western colonial imperiality. So maybe I should begin with imperiality, because it's a concept that sounds, of course, as two other concepts, at least two other concepts we know well, which is one, empire, and secondly, colonialism or coloniality, for that matter. So in my view, there is a distinction, and a distinction needs to be made for different reasons. There is not one single definition of imperiality, but there are different functions, in my view, that makes this concept, if you will, useful. So the first thing I should say is that for me, imperiality is first a way precisely of reconfiguring, if you will, the very terms of the debate about political theology, as you mentioned. So I'm trying to argue that, if you will, the claims to absolute power emerging from so-called secular, but it could also be religious forms of state sovereignty in the modern world, are not just quote-unquote secularized Christian theology. They're also forms of imperialization. It begins with the very fact that when we talk about Christianity in general, this is already not a false view, but potentially mistaken way of talking, because it's a bit historically unprecise. And I'm going to try and tell you why, in my view. The book doesn't go back to that foundational event, but we could take that as a point of departure. After all, the conversion of Constantine to the Roman emperor to the religion of Christ is one of the foundational moments of, if you will, the foundation of what we call the church, and of institutional Christianity, at least, right? And this is not even Western Christendom, which is a later formation of that. But I just want to emphasize first, without going into the details of that particular moment, but that there is the mediation of the Roman emperor here. So what I call imperiality is the fact that when we talk about Western Christendom, we're talking about a hybrid of at least two different things that are not the same: Christ, Rome. And I'm trying to say that when states, monarchies, churches, empires, at least in the West, claimed absolute power on earth, they did it either as emperors, but if they were not formally emperors, they claimed to be the representative of gods or God on earth, to the extent that they were claiming an imperial title, which I call imperiality, if you will. So the imperial title means that there is an imperial mediation in the way in which earthly power claim to speak in the name of heaven or in the name of God, right? So this is a way of unpacking, if you will, the criticism of the category of religion, which, sometimes leads to, I would say, exaggerated form of constructivism, which would say that it's only a sort of discursive invention, and without exactly describing what might be described by the concept of religion, but nevertheless not fully described or accurately described by this concept, right? So what's behind the concept? I think there are many things behind the concept, but I think that when people, regardless of their political orientation at this stage, say, but look at the way in which religions have been so violent, if not the worst thing that happened to humanity, because it provokes absence of toleration, wars, hatred, and so on and so forth. All phenomena that people characterize as violent or violence. And the first thing I'm trying to say is that when it comes to at least the history of the West, imperiality is a way of making sense of the specific historical configuration, formations, event behind this myth of religious violence, or the myth of monotheistic violence. What kind of monotheism are we talking about? What kind of Christianity even are we talking about? And it's not just in general that, there are transfers between the theological and the political. Is that the mediator that makes the transfer possible is what I call imperiality. Now, this is just, if you will, the basic scene. This is not even the argument I'm making. I'm trying to frame the question in that way, right? Now, if you start framing the question that way, then it has both philosophical and historical consequences that I will try to describe. The first thing I'm arguing is that one of the specificities of Western imperial formations, as opposed to, if you will, non-Western imperial formations, is that precisely the West led to modern colonialism, right? So I refuse, and I'm against using the word colonialism when it comes, for example, to describing, for example, quote unquote Islamic empires or the Chinese empire, or the Ottoman Empire for that matter, and so on and so forth. The fact that there is empire doesn't mean to say, and of course empires can be violent, but it doesn't mean to say that it's the same kind of violence, and certainly not that it's the same thing as colonialism as such, which for me began not exactly only in 1492, because I think it probably began by the middle of the 15th century, but maybe we'll come back to that. But the basic argument is what? The basic argument is that in the West, precisely, since at least the Reformation and the failures of Charles Quint, that is to say the failure to reunite, if you will, Christendom, there is no such thing as one empire anymore, right? Historically, some medieval historians I'm in conversation with could even argue and have been using the concept of imperiality to say that even during the Middle Ages, even the notion of a unity of empire was mostly ideological and was more a myth than a reality. But let's leave this aside. This is a potential debate. The main argument, and there is a consensus on that with these historians I was mentioning, is that there is no unity of empire, right? There is no one empire, even though, of course, there is one emperor who represents the Holy Roman German Empire, still at the time, until, in fact, Napoleon is going to invade, if you will, present-day Germany, to use that word. So the notion is that there is no empire, and therefore, kingdoms, monarchies, are increasingly going to claim the right to be emperors in their own land, in their own kingdom, right? It's actually a sentence that comes from the Middle Ages, the sentence that says, from what I know, it's a French monarch who first invented this notion, whose name is Philippe le Bel, but you'll find this used by the British monarchy a few centuries later. And the sentence is, this realm is an empire, that kingdom is an empire, ce royaume est un empire, right? Which is a very specific sentence, if you will, geopolitically, because it claims that it doesn't need the emperor, which in that case means the Holy German Empire. And in many cases, it also means, certainly in the case of Britain, it doesn't need the mediation of the Roman Church to be an emperor and to build an empire on this territory, which is the monarchy, which means that the monarchy, the kingdom, is in itself an empire because it claims this imperial title, right? And therefore, there is, of course, a theological dimension to that claim. Once again, Britain is a very good example because, of course, by saying that they do not need the mediation or the legitimization of the church, they can claim to be the direct representatives of God on earth, and also the direct, if you will, masters of their own churches, which are going to be state churches, state-controlled churches, and increasingly, but this is a process that happens, I think, mostly during the 19th century, which is quite different, which is the nationalization of religious identities, if you will. So the third, to some extent, argument I'm trying to make vis-a-vis this notion of imperiality, which is what I call, to distinguish this from what happened during the Middle Ages, if you will, is colonial imperiality. That is to say that when these kingdoms start claiming that there are empires and emperors within their own territory, actually they go beyond that territory, so to speak. That is to say that colonialism, what we call modern colonialism since 1492, is going to become, from an ideological point of view, the embodiment of imperiality. That is to say, the embodiment of this claim to restore or to be the emperor. I say restore because, and this is a sort of, if you will, dialectic analysis I'm trying to propose, especially at the very end of the book, which is that it's precisely because the old dream of the empire is failing, is made impossible by colonialism itself, that colonialism, if you will, is perpetuated and perpetrated, right? That is to say, colonialism is fundamentally structured by this, of course, Christian imperiality, doesn't mean to say Christianity itself. And precisely because the claim of the absolute is impossible, colonialism is disseminated, and precisely because colonialism disseminates and fragments the very dream of empire, it makes it impossible as much as it's trying to embody that dream, right? So this is I would say the first argument, and to me, secularization is an effect, if you will, or rather, I should say, is one of the manifestations of that process that mainly happens during the 19th century, which is a sort of intensification. But of course, it has, as I'm trying to show, sort of older and longer history, which I'm trying to describe. But maybe we'll talk more about that.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, in terms of the sort of the encounter with a particular kind of imperiality or a particular kind of historical empire from the 19th century, one of the main motor examples in the book is that of one of arguably the world's first secular empire, which is the Napoleonic Empire, the First Empire of France, and particularly their relationship with North Africa, particularly Egypt and eventually Algeria. Could you unpack to what extent the encounter between these sort of revolutionary secularizing forces of the French Empire and Napoleon with the Muslim lands of North Africa, how did that encounter sort of invert or change the way the imperiality manifests in relation to religion? Because there's a really interesting point in the book where you talk specifically about conversion, about a shift away from the 1492 model of the Reconquista, where everyone was forced to convert to Christianity, as opposed to the relatively one. I'm saying tolerant with a lot of air quotes here of the plurality of religions that you get with the Napoleonic period.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's indeed more specifically the object of chapter 1 of this book. So this is how the historical analysis really begins in the book. Well, first you have the sentence, which is the declaration of Napoleon when he invaded Egypt in 1798, so during the French Revolution, so to speak. And the sentence is really disturbing, which is he's talking to the, if you will, Islamic authorities of Egypt, and he's saying to them, tell the people that we being the French army, the French Revolutionary Army, we, the French army, are true Muslims. It's not a sentence that was unknown, right? It's a sentence that, for example, is quoted in Edward Said's famous book Orientalism. And I didn't really notice, I must say, the sentence when I read the book the first time. I encountered the sentence elsewhere, and then I realized, rereading Said's book, that actually he quoted the sentence. But I think I didn't really remember it because it's not really central to his analysis. Also because Said is struggling with how to analyze this sentence, right? Which seems to be a detail, but I will explain why. In my view, it's much more than a detail. The first interpretation, of course, that may come to mind is that this is pure opportunism, right? But it's different to say he was an opportunist and to claim that he was only an opportunist, that is to say, to reduce this to pure opportunism, right? Which I think is not a really strong argument because it makes, this psychological. Said hesitates, but on the whole, he says it's not just pure opportunism, but, he sort of frames that as belonging to his sort of general framework of, Orientalism as being this sort of colonial discourse and so on and so forth. The beginning of the book, The States of the Earth, is to take some distance from this framework, but not to abandon the critique of Orientalism, but to integrate the critique of Orientalism within a broader framework, right? That also allows us to analyze not just Orientalism, but the very structure of imperial, colonial, capitalistic powers that made Orientalism possible, I would say even necessary in certain ways, for their own interests, rather than simply saying, what is the problem with Orientalism, as if Orientalism and racism and so on and so forth were just states of exceptions and therefore had nothing to do with what stands at the core. I wouldn't say of modernity. I'm trying also to unpack that word, but of, if you will, the hellish trinity of states, capital, and empires. So what is the argument I'm trying to make? The argument is that when Napoleon claims we are true Muslims, he says in the same sentence, in the same declaration, it's not something that Said quotes, and not something that post-colonial theory or decolonial theory has really analyzed. He says we're true Muslim to the extent that we have a common enemy, and this common enemy is the Roman Catholic Church. Right? Which means that the very declaration, we are true Muslims, if you don't look at the history of Europe only in Europe, manifests a much more central transformation, which is the transformation of how, quote unquote, politics and theology are interacting in the West and in so-called modern times. Now, a Eurocentric perspective, I wouldn't say it would necessarily be a bad perspective politically or morally, but limited, would argue, yes, well, there was a secularization that happened, for example, during the 17th century, and to some extent, the French Revolution is its last sort of manifestation, and so on and so forth, and therefore Napoleon comes as a secularized man, and therefore he says that or claims that. Another perspective, not completely opposed to the first one, is to say this is a manifestation of something that did not happen, but that is happening. That is to say that the declaration is already participating in a process that we have to name, and for the lack of a better word, I call imperial secularization. That is to say, Napoleon is the heir of what I was calling imperiality, but all of a sudden, imperiality is being used against its own Christian matrix. That is to say, he uses imperiality against the Christian church. More precisely, in this case, he's talking about the Roman Church, but it's an anti-Christian argument, right? I mean, it's a declaration, but to some extent there is an argument concealed in the declaration, probably. But nevertheless, what I mean is that when he says we are true Muslims, he's inaugurating, if you will, participating at least in the slow, of course, emergence of a new kind of colonial power. And this new kind of colonial power is not just colonial, because it's going to have an impact on the way in which he is going to govern France and the kind of institutions he's going to implement in France, but also, let's not forget that, throughout Europe, right? So I'm saying, of course, not that, European modernity began in 1798 in Egypt, of course, but I'm trying to say that something about the history of secularization happens in Egypt. And this belongs to Orientalism, but also explains their interconnections. In the book, I'm also trying to, this is in the introduction of the book, to clarify how it, changes some of the analyses of Said, because we forgot, in fact, that Said did not say, or did not only argue, that colonialism was Orientalism and vice versa, which is something that, he didn't invent. I mean, someone like Anwar Abdel Malik or Abdel Kibir Khatibi, at least since the mid 60s, this argument was already made, mostly by French speaking Arab theorists that actually Said quotes. But I wouldn't say that this is necessarily his most original argument. But one of the arguments he has to make, even though it doesn't really strike people, also because, it's a book that's quoted but not often read, is precisely that at some point he needs to say, well, the very perception of the quote-unquote or the so-called Orient had to be secularized before it was really used as a quote-unquote colonial instrument. And this happened during the second half of the 18th century. That was before any, if you will, Muslim majority country, to use an anachronistic word. So basically no parts of North Africa or Asia were actually colonized by European empires by then. I mean, at that stage. But the old, if you will, Christian hatred of a figure like Mahomet or Prophet Mohammed as the Antichrist, the devil itself, or even an idol, were, if you will, vanishing. Doesn't mean to say that it was completely disappearing, but its authority was less prominent. And one started talking about Muhammad as a legislator, as a great man, also because he was analyzed not just as the false prophet, rather as a great man who knew how to use religion for political purposes. And one of his alleged political purposes was precisely what then European Orientalism understands as a form of imperialism. Right? And this is why for Napoleon, actually, Muhammad is a certain model, right? Not a religious model, not a spiritual model, not a prophetic model as such, but a political model of achieving world global imperial sovereignty, of using religions for political purposes. And to some extent, it's even a model of masculinity for him, if you will, from a gender perspective, if you will. And I think that all these layers are present in this sentence that seems to be a detail: we are true Muslims, quote unquote, which of course helps us also see some of the dynamics of racism that will slowly emerge as being, of course, expropriating people from their own traditions, or rather from the knowledge of their own traditions, or religions for that matter, but it's also, their philosophies, their ways of life, if you will. But it's also, in this particular case, also claiming the signifier of Islam or the Islamic against Muslims themselves, right? So I'm saying that in a very counterintuitive way, this is a formation of secularization, rather than simply saying, of course, secularization is the death of religion or the slow disappearance. Once you start from there, you change the geography of the question. So you stop saying, okay, we're going to analyze secularization from a purely Eurocentric perspective. That is to say, we look at Christianity, the specificities of Christianity will explain why they led to the self-dissolution of Christianity, and so on and so forth, which in the end is Hegelianism, whether we like to talk, because this is in fact what Hegel called, part of what Hegel called absolute knowledge. So you change the geography, you go beyond the West, you say that actually what we call quote unquote secularization is an effect of the interactions between the metropoles and the colonies, right? And the second thing you say, of course, is that, of course, secularization did not engender the end or even the decay of religious formations. It created their internal transformations and to a certain extent their intensification via some of the time, even though not always, forms of individualization of will faith-based practices.
No, absolutely. In terms of the transformation of religion, in terms of making it in a way an object of study as a category of anthropology, it really seems like there's two sort of strands here. I mean, for one, when you was talking earlier about sort of the way in which imperiality and coloniality seem to be undermine each other at the same time as they can indeed enable each other in sort of a positive feedback loop sort of way, it does seem like there's something which this secularization fulfills, I guess, what someone like Lewis Gordon would call theological naturalism. This idea that, I mean, his analysis, of the origin of race from 1492, sort of the Reconquista period, where we talk about the idea of the converts, people from different Abrahamic religions, as having different, essentially naturalistic bloodlines, and then at the same time, there's this analysis in your work of this secularization, this change to an anthropological view of religion as being fundamentally the creation of racial categories, particularly in your examples, particularly from chapter 1, the racialization of Islam. At one point you say that, the signifier of Islam became a racial name, literally a name for race itself, once Muslims were declared to be inconvertible but colonizable. And this figure of the inconvertible here seems to really be in tension with this Hegelian ideology of the French sort of expansional colonialism, which is this idea of a kind of Christian universalism. Can we talk a little bit about sort of this philosophy of universality, or this universal imperiality, and the ways in which it both enables and is limited by the ways in which it starts producing these kinds of new forms of racialization?
Yeah, I think there might be two questions here. Maybe I'll start with Hegel and explain also maybe the why I came, to write this book, and why I thought it was a needed inquiry. But actually, I was working critically on Hegel. That was, a long time ago now, and more than 10 years. And for different reasons, I encountered Hegel as almost a sort of ethnographic phenomenon, if you will. And I'm interested in knowing what it means to practice the history of Western philosophy as an anthropologist, if you will, but because I was both terrified by some of the sentences, famous, very exclusionary sentences of Hegel, but on the other hand, I sort of knew intuitively that it was difficult to, reduce him to that and his legacy to that. And certainly, if you take into account the fact that figures like Fanon are, if not Hegelian, there is a certain kind of complex relationship with dialectics. So I started being disappointed and unsatisfied with how he was criticized, if you will, right? That is to say, not that I didn't think that he needed to be criticized, but I thought that the criticism was not completely both doing justice to him, and therefore was not, quote unquote, radical enough, because it didn't really analyze the core of the system, right? If you criticize a system, or even if you want to dismantle a system, you have to be systemic, if not systematic, in the way you dismantle it, right? So I thought, okay, what is the core, if you will, not the core argument, that would be a very un-Hegelian way of speaking, but the core gesture, if you will, and what is this absolute? And I think fundamentally, secularization is a good way of understanding what Hegel is trying to do. I think I mentioned that briefly en passant, that for me, in my view, absolute knowledge, absolute knowing, is a reflection on how Hegel himself reconstruct Christianity within the framework of a progressive consciousness that corresponds, at least at the very end of the phenomenology of spirit, to a progressive history of religions, right? So the last chapter, or rather the chapter before the chapter, which is in fact the real last section of the phenomenology of spirit on absolute knowing, the chapter before the last is on religion. It starts with so-called natural religions. Today we would call them animist religion, so to speak. Then it moves to, what he knew about Egyptian proto-monotheism, let's put it that way. And then he moves quite directly to the religion of art, which more or less corresponds to antique Greek antiquity. And then he goes on to talk about revealed religion, which is identified with Christianity, right? So it doesn't mean to say that what he says about Christianity is Christianity itself, but it's a philosophical conceptualization of Christianity as a dialectical movement. And his basic argument, if you will, even though for him it's the dialectical movement and the self transformations of Christianity itself, from his point of view. And he says that within the Christian rituals, actually Christian negate their own representation of God. They self-dissolve, if you will, without noticing it, without acknowledging it, that God is dead, by which he means that there is no such thing as a transcendence of God, which he calls abstract. He doesn't talk about transcendence, he talks about abstraction. But basically this is what he means, that is to say the fact that God would be some sort of absolute being, an object external to us that would be unknowable, right? And basically Hegel claims that the absolute is a process of self-sacrifice, which of course comes to self-consciousness through us, since we are within the truth, which is exactly what he says as an anticipation in the preface, right, of the Phenomenology of Spirit. This is why he criticizes how he criticizes modern theories of knowledge, let's say schematically from Descartes to Kant, right? So what's my argument? My argument is that if secularization is a discourse, and here I'm talking about secularization, if you will, as what Western philosophy has enunciated, has proclaimed, right? Now, my concept of secularization is a way of making sense, of analyzing critically this enunciation. But this is also my point of departure. Who said that there was going to be a secularization of Christianity on earth, right? Hegel said that. And of course, a few figures of French colonialism, imperialism, and republicanism during the 19th century, because Hegel did have, and I'm trying to show that in the book, an unknown political colonial legacy in France and within French colonialism. Maybe we'll talk more about that. But to go back to the point, my point is that Hegel cannot argue this, cannot deploy the mythology of secularization as, which is not what I argue, which is what he argues, secularization as, if you will, the globalization of Christianity, that is to say, the analysis, which is Hegelian, that presupposes that what we call quote unquote modernity is nothing else than the self-realization of Christianity beyond Christianity itself. So to some extent, it's Christianity being the only religion that led to its own dissolution within the secular and to the dissolution of religions in general, right? Which is also what Bauer is going to argue and so on and so forth. Feuerbach is going to use this in a specific way. This is a major argument, right? Major. And part of the book, one of the philosophical stakes of the book, is to both criticize that, but not just like a sort of external critique. Criticize that by showing that this discourse is part of the deployment of a new kind of imperialism that's going to affect actually capitalism itself, right? This is my main argument, is to analyze Hegelianism as a discursive formation that shows that Descartes, if you will, or Cartesian dualism is not, if you will, the colonial ideology par excellence anymore, right? Maybe it was, which is debatable, but that now, since the 19th century at least, what Hegel argues, of course, is not the colonial ideology, but participates, in fact, in the process of, if you will, imperial processes of globalization, which means that we have to have a direct, self-conscious, critical understanding of what's at stake when we talk about Hegel, right? And I'm not trying to say this is just imperialism full stop, right? It did participate in that, but the problem philosophically to also dismantle the Western canon, or rather the hegemony of the Western canon differently, is to ask the problem differently, because as we know, there is no solution without asking a problem differently. No new solution without asking a problem differently. Now, the second layer of my argument is that, and this is why, of course, there is an imperiality within Hegelianism, is that Hegel could not have argued this if he did not read pages and pages of biblical criticists we don't read anymore, of Orientalists we don't read anymore, and so on and so forth. So basically, quote unquote, minor intellectuals, if you will, some of them were philosophers who, in fact, contributed in their own way to the emergence not only of Orientalism, but of the human sciences, and also of things like comparative linguistic, as I said, biblical criticism, but also philology, and so on and so forth, right? Which is something I analyzed more in a book that's not yet published. But nevertheless, the point is that he needs a certain concept of the Orient to analyze Western modernity as Christianity on earth, or as Christianity full stop, actually. And what is the specific concept of the so-called Orient he's deploying? The notion of a confusion between politics and religion, of course, but actually Hegel is much more interesting than just, than actually most Orientalists at that time, because he says that Islam is a revolution, the revolution of the Orient, which he compares to the French Revolution. It has a history that I cannot fully analyze today, but he says that via this comparison, that Islam is terror, but compared to Robespierre's terror. Because he says that it's a revolutionary moment, that precisely because it has no idea of the incarnation, because it's not Christian, basically, according to his own definition of Christianity. Therefore, it was not able to actually create a process of Verweltlichung, right? That is to say, of making religion real, that is to say, secularization. And only Christianity did this via and through the French Revolution. according to him. And for me, there is an interdependency, if you will, between what Hegel is going to claim as absolute knowledge and the centrality of this kind of Orientalist discourse, if you will, in the making of this very claim, right? And this is not just saying Hegel subjectively is racist. It doesn't really matter to me anymore, right? I mean, this is not this is not what's at stake. What's at stake is precisely the kind of conceptual assumptions that are going to be made, but also beyond Hegel himself, are going to remain as fragments, if you will, in a fragmented way, within both Western philosophy, but also in social sciences and the humanities. Of course, this should be qualified and this should be nuanced, but this would be the object of another conversation. I'm saying this en passant. But the main point I want to do, if you will, by saying this, is that what Hegel said about Islam, or the quote unquote the so-called Orient, is not something marginal. But you realize that it's central if you start writing the very history of 19th century Western, the 19th century Western world from an interconnected perspective that is going to allow you to see how and why it's central. So you have to change the narrative if you want to sort of see the centrality. Now, you had another question about inconvertibility and so on and so forth. Very briefly, the point I'm trying to make, and this might also help understand how I'm both criticizing Hegel by inscribing him within a philosophical history, in fact, right? Saying that the kind of philosophy of history he did was part of the problem and therefore is not really the proper philosophical history we should write about himself and also the 19th century Europe. But also, if you will, it comes from the fact that I'm trying to avoid simply saying, because it's not innocent, that, for example, the Reconquista is just Christianity full stop, right? Which would be a reversed Hegelianism, right? Which is what many Nietzscheans do, and sometimes they're Foucauldians or Derridians, but the matrix of that is Nietzsche. Is because, as you can see, if you're anti-Christian, and if your anti-Christian discourse simply argues, well, the modern world in general is horrible, the modern world is Christianity, therefore we should criticize Christianity because this is the modern world, or modern capitalism for that matter. And I'm saying this is pure reversed Hegelianism, right? Of course, Hegel said the same thing by saying, therefore, this is the legitimate triumph of the West. But from a discursive perspective, this is mainly the same gesture in a reversed way, right? So I'm trying to avoid that. And this is also why I use the concept of imperiality as something that is not quite reducible to this sort of pre-constituted concept of Christianity in general, or Christianity as such. And there comes the question, if you will, of blood and of race. Because you could say that, and of course I'm not contesting that the Spanish Empire was a Christian empire, right? But it was an empire in the making. And I'm simply saying that even when there was a massive conversion of Jewish people and Muslims in what was then called Al-Andalus, starting not to be called Al-Andalus anymore, that despite the fact that some of them, those who stayed, were forced to convert to Christianity, something started to emerge, or rather, to be really precise, started to intensify and to paved the way to actual discriminatory laws, racist laws, what was starting to emerge was the notion that there remains something inconvertible, despite the fact that these people are converted to Christianity. So despite the conversion, there remains something inconvertible, and this is precisely what they're going to call, what the Christians at that time are going to call, impure blood. Right? The impurity of blood, of course, doesn't refer to anything biological or whatever, but it's not just a discursive construction to the extent that it refers to a certain degree of inconvertibility that the Christians suspect and that they describe as something that will eternally remain inconvertible, which is precisely, supposedly, inscribed within their blood, right? So I'm not contesting that this could be seen as one of the matrices of what we call now racism. I think we should take the question of the Crusades a bit more seriously, but I don't fetishize beginnings as being origin, so therefore the debate is open-ended in my view, the discussion is open-ended. But I'm trying simply to say, of course, that this has to do with Christian and imperial dynamics, because both are not quite the same or reducible to one another. But that this creates, if you will, a dynamic of, and a dialectic, if you will, of convertibility and inconvertibility that is going to reappear, if you will, in a different way, in my view, in a place like colonial Algeria, at the beginning of the French colonization of North Africa, that is to say around the 1830s, where in fact what happens is that you have a similar form of power, but in my view, it's not exactly the same. And it doesn't really help to just say this is exactly the same as what they did during the Reconquista, and therefore it's just Christianity full stop, to the extent that, as you now realize probably, this would just reproduce a reversed Hegelian framework, right? Or Nietzschean, if you will. So I'm trying to say, no, the dynamics of power are precisely dynamics, and therefore some things stay the same, but precisely for that reason, they also change certain things, and we happen to see certain transformations at stake, right? Even though they might be subterranean. And one of these transformations is that, interestingly enough, now the colonial administration does not say, let's force them to convert massively to Christianity, or we'll just expel them or murder them. The colonial administration limits very rigorously. At some point, in fact, it was legally forbidden to even try and convert the indigenous Algerian population, so Jews and Muslims. It was forbidden, and or, depending on the moment, strictly it was strictly surveilled, actually, would be the best word, and therefore limited. It was so regulated or forbidden, depending on the moments, to actually try and convert the indigenous population of Algeria to Christianity, right? Because this was seen as a potential threat to the colonial order, that is to say, as a possible potential threat, to the extent that it might, or so was the colonial argument, it might then awaken what they would call Islamic fanaticism, right? Which basically meant nothing else than the fact that actually there were insurrections against the French colonial army that indeed were partly, if you will, organized by Muslim authorities. I could quote Abdel Kader, who is an interesting figure because he's both a Muslim fighter, an anti-colonial figure before anti-colonialism, but also I mentioned it en passant, a philosopher and a metaphysician. People don't realize that. But so basically, when the French say that, they are remembering the specter and the heritage of someone like Abdul Qadir, and they're saying, well, actually Abdul Qadir was just using quote unquote Islamic fanaticism against us. So we have to show Muslims, right, that we respect their religions and that we're not trying to convert them to Christianity, precisely because if we do so, then we will not lead them to resist to the colonization, and therefore we will be able to stabilize, if you will, the colonial order. So this is why, and I'm not saying this is the case with all kinds of secularizing formation, but that in this particular instance, there is a strategic secularization of imperial power to the extent that it has to give signs of its own supposed secularity. But I'm not saying that its secularity is a mask of something else that would be concealed Christianity. A, because the colonial administration is not, most of them are not necessarily Christians. And B, it does create real effects. That is, it does change the technologies of power at play. And so from the perspective of inconvertibility, what emerges, and this is called l'indigénat in French, right, which is basically the division of citizenships and subjects, so the French citizen and the colonial subject. And what happens is that you see an interesting figure emerging, and you find this expression in sort of court archives, juridical archives of the beginning of the 20th century, where some Algerian Muslims who converted to Christianity, Catholicism more precisely, were deemed not Christians. They were described as Catholic Muslims by the colonial administration. So what is a Catholic Muslim exactly? It means that Muslim, the signifier, refers to race, and therefore is something fundamentally inconvertible, right? But the difference with, if you will, the Spanish Empire is that precisely the strategy is not to convert anymore, right? So the colonial administration is not entirely satisfied with these people who convert to Christianity. It's not really what they're looking for, right? So these are the kind of transformations I'm trying to analyze as being not secularization full stop, but dimensions of this history that we need to take into account if we want to reanalyze and redescribe differently what we call modernity, if you will.
No, absolutely. This I think is really one of the strengths of the book in providing a political theology of these kinds of new forms of apartheid. Well, they're not new, but the in a way, sort of a genealogy, not to degenize it too much, of that kind of these forms of apartheid, which we see manifest particularly, of course, in the ongoing genocide in Palestine today, being the most obvious example coming to mind. And I think also the discourse on Hegelianism, this creating of a racialized other to which one can project racialized qualities onto. And I think it's a very needed thing in our contemporary discourse on Hegel. There's been somewhat of a retreat in light of sort of the anti-colonial critique of Hegel to sort of let's say sort of the Motte and Bailey of Hegelian Christianity. I mean, we see there's a lot of new books on Hegelian Christianity as this kind of universalist framework. I mean, even some works, for example, like Hegel and Haiti, defend sort of Hegel's sort of radical chops on that basis. But even in Hegel's understanding of the Haitian Revolution, he says it's good because it's a Christian one, when it ostensibly wasn't. It just simply participates in the dialectical structure he's ascribing to it. But I know we're coming towards time very soon. I mean, if just one more question, because there's one more topic we didn't get into just as much. But so let's get into it just quickly, which is the link between secularization and sort of the way in which capital gets hooked on fossil fuels, particularly the ways in which secularization, in a way, indexes not only the extent to which the state can sort of divorce itself from the church in order to take sieges of land, but also the very way in which secularization serves to undermine, I guess, the rituals or taboos that may indeed prevent certain kinds of resource extraction.
Yeah. Well, I guess I should begin with Marx, I suppose now. Because so one of the ways in which I'm trying to describe that is to say that somehow when we asked the earth to bear the burden of heaven, we destroyed the earth, which is of course something that needs to be analyzed, but it's a way of saying that secularization was, first of all, a discourse of trying to make heaven on earth, which is also what Hegel himself described. And making heaven on earth was something that was declared, it was a promise that was made, precisely as capitalism, imperialism was, deploying itself, if I may put it that way, but also a moment when extractivism and more specifically fossil capitalism emerged. So I'm trying to make these connections, and what happens underground, right, is to me the underground history and also the material history of precisely all of the philosophical, metaphysical questions we talked about in the first part of this interview. But so it has to do with a certain rereading of Marx, right, which is also a certain kind of, if you will, immanent, not to say really internal, but immanent critique of Marx and Marxism. I will not talk about why I think that the very question of secularization is in fact both present but absent in especially in the young Marx. That would be another topic. But to talk about fossil fuels specifically, I recently reread Capital One, and when he talks about the machine, and he does talk about steam power, and most of what eco-Marxists have been telling us about the emergence of fossil capitalism is basically there. I mean, most of the arguments are in Marx, right? That is to say that, if you will, the transition to the usage of steam power did not emerge all of a sudden because Watt invented the steam engine itself. It appeared at a specific moment when capitalism was, and I insist on that because I think Marx sees the tension, but not all Marxists do, were forced to use fossil fuels and the steam engine within textile production specifically, but also increasingly in other fields of production. And the question is, how and why were they forced to do so? And if you read Marx carefully, he actually mentions, among other things, because of course there is the fact that coal, as opposed to water, is something that can be transported, and therefore the centers of production could be moved in urban centers, and of course this also led to the very making of the the modern working class, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that he mentions and that I'm interested in is the fact that the limitation of labor time intervenes as something that really constrains the capitalist class to intensify, if you will, the rhythm of production, which participates in the transition from relative surplus value, from absolute surplus value to relative surplus value. So the very making of relative surplus value, if you will, to simplify, via the intensification of productivity, but also an intensification, of course, of labor extraction during this limited time of actual labor, that actually the use of steam and therefore of coal was a way for capitalism to meet the legal requirements made by the British state, which came from a counter-insurrectional way of, if you will, both doing justice to some of the workers' insurrections, but also by doing justice to them, of course, we're trying to, of course, pacify, right? By which I mean, of course, extinguish and if you will, negate the workers' insurrection itself. And I'm saying that this has to do with the intervention of the law and of the state. And at some point, Marx even says that this is precisely what's going to intensify capitalism, and that what we call fossil capitalism is just an aspect of this dynamic, right? Which is very central, but should not be, separated from the broader picture. And I'm simply saying, if you will, that if the law is involved, then the state is involved. And that it is not possible, and I think that when Marx writes Capital, he has already abandoned this notion that can be found in some passages of the Communist Manifesto, but I think Marx revised that at least as the Parisian Commune, but probably before that, this notion that the state is simply the instrument of the bourgeoisie. And more precisely, simply the instrument of capitalism or the capitalist class. It doesn't mean to say, of course, that state violence, or in this case, state regulation of violence via law, it doesn't mean to say that this doesn't belong to a dynamic which, of course, involves centrally capitalism. But to say that the state is only capitalism, as if it was just an instrument of capitalism, is to make us unable to understand why capitalism still needs state violence to extract, exploit, legitimize exploitation via law, make it juridical, make this exploitation legal, and to, of course, describe that as freedom. And it reminds us, in my view, of the fact that what Marx used to call the so-called primitive accumulation of capital was expropriation, of course, the separation between the labor, or rather the worker, and the conditions or the means of production. But precisely if you follow the analysis and you read the entire section, that is to say the entire chapters, which is the end, if you will, the conclusion of Capital 1, you'll realize that what is at stake, what is central to primitive accumulation, is precisely the making of what we call the modern nation state and the kind of violence it is able to implement and to deploy against people, against humans, if you will, but also against land meaning the land, but also the subsoils, which is not something that Marx analyzes, but that I'm trying to analyze in the book. So here's, if you will, my interpretation, which is which departs, of course, from some of the some Marxist interpretation of that, but which is resonant, at least, with certain aspects of the analysis of capital. The argument is that the state is involved. Primitive accumulation is not over. It's not an origin for that reason. And Marx says that very clearly, especially in the very last chapter of Capital about colonialism. He quotes the Opium Wars, which is 19th century. So it means that if this is part of the so-called primitive accumulation, it means that primitive accumulation was not over by the 16th century. It means that colonialism is part of that, to the extent that colonialism is part of state violence and determines how state violence also functions within the so-called metropoles. However, and this is where I'm trying to add a certain layer to the analysis of capitalism, what we call secularization is part of that process. Why? Because you cannot analyze state violence and state sovereignty without political theology. And because precisely the very nature of the sovereignty of this state that gave birth to capitalism, doesn't mean to say it is capitalism, but gave birth to capitalism, this state formation is a secularizing power, to the extent that it's an imperializing power. Now, of course, some people might say, but why would you attack secularization? We need it because religions are oppressive. And I want to remind our people who are listening to us that, for me, the dialectics between imperiality, colonial imperiality, and secularization, they explain also the new kinds of religious formations that also go hand in hand with capitalism. So it's not that it only created secularism, it also created new forms of politicizing religion. Also in association sometimes with fossil fuel, and specifically with oil extraction. So this is the idea, and if I had to summarize the argument in strategic Marxist word, I would say that imperiality and secularization are part of the so-called primitive accumulation of capital. And of course, of capital in general, but also of fossil capitalism, more specifically, or fossil capital. So this is what I'm trying to bring to the tradition of, or to the critique of capital. There is something that is not really in the book, but I tried to clarify in a paper that is called "How the Critique of Heaven Confines the Critique of the Earth," which was published in a journal called Qui Parle, and in French it was published first in Actuel Marx, which to some extent reverses Marx, to the extent that it's trying to say that the critique of heaven or the critique of religion should not be the condition of all critique, or the condition of the critique of capital and the state, as Marx argued when he was young in 1844, but rather that we should start from the critique of capital and the state as imperiality, if you will, or sustained by imperiality, in my view, as being not the same thing, capital and the state. And from there, and from a materialist critique of these formations, state and capital, then to understand religious formations and to deploy another kind of critique of religions. So the critique of the earth, if you will, becomes the condition for any critique of heaven, which is what I'm trying to do, if you will.
And it is an incredibly vital project. The aspect of secularization in primitive accumulation is particularly underrated in terms of, the various ways in which capital was just freed up from the seizure of monasteries, which allowed, the European princes to start competing with the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, in the silver trade in Peru. It is such a vital thing to highlight, and I think this book is fantastic in actually bringing this back to the forefront beyond any kind of hand wavy. This is a very vulgar Marxist caricature I'm putting up here, sort of hand waving away of the critique of religion as if, to do so would take us back to the 1840s. But Mohamed, I just want to say thanks again for joining us on the show. Folks, The States of the Earth is available now from Verso. And I just want to ask, do you have any other things coming up, any other publications you'd like to plug? I know you're also a performing musician, if you'd like to plug that. I mean, we'll put all the links down below. I mean, where can people find more of your work?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it was a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thanks for the invitation.